You opened your phone to check one thing. Maybe the time, maybe a quick message. And then, somewhere between that moment and the next, 20 minutes disappeared. You didn't choose to lose them. You didn't sit down and decide to scroll. It just happened. And the strangest part isn't that it happened once, it's that it keeps happening every single day. In a cycle you can't seem to break no matter how many times you tell yourself you'll do better tomorrow. That's not a willpower problem. That's not a discipline failure. That is your brain operating exactly the way it was designed to operate. Just inside an environment it was never designed to handle. That distinction matters more than almost anything else you'll hear on this topic. Because the moment you understand that your distraction isn't a character flaw, but a mechanical process, you stop fighting yourself and start understanding yourself. And understanding is where real change begins. Let's start at the foundation. Your brain has one core operating principle that overrides almost everything else. Minimize threat, maximize reward. This isn't a metaphor. This is a biological directive that has been running inside every human brain for hundreds of thousands of years. The structures responsible for this, particularly the limbic system and the basal ganglia, are ancient. They predate language, logic, and self-awareness by a significant margin. And at the center of this reward system sits dopamine. Not happiness, as it's commonly misunderstood. Dopamine is not the chemical that makes you feel good. Dopamine is the chemical that makes you want. It's the signal your brain fires when it anticipates something rewarding. And that subtle difference changes everything. When you feel the urge to check your phone mid-task, dopamine is already involved before you even pick it up. Your brain has learned, through repetition, that the phone contains unpredictable rewards. A new notification, a surprising post, an unexpected message. The unpredictability is the key mechanism. Neuroscientists call this variable reward scheduling, and it is one of the most powerful behavioral reinforcement patterns ever studied. The brain releases more dopamine in response to uncertain rewards than predictable ones. This is why you don't feel the same compulsive pull toward checking your refrigerator that you feel toward checking your social media feed. The refrigerator gives you the same thing every time. Your phone never does. Never. This is the first layer of the mechanism. Your brain isn't seeking distraction because it's broken. It's seeking distraction because it has been trained through thousands of small repetitions to expect that distraction will deliver an unpredictable dopamine hit. And once that pattern is encoded, it becomes nearly automatic. The prefrontal cortex, which handles rational planning and long-term thinking, has to actively override the signal. And that override requires mental energy. Real, measurable, depletable mental energy. Depletable. This is where the problem compounds. Because in modern life, the prefrontal cortex is already exhausted before most people even sit down to do deep work. Think about the average morning. Notifications before the alarm is off. News headlines absorbed while half asleep. Decisions about emails, schedules, and obligations, all processed before 9 a.m. Each of these micro-decisions draws from the same limited cognitive resource pool. Researchers often refer to this as decision fatigue and attentional depletion. By the time you actually need focused, concentrated mental effort, your brain's executive function is already running on partial capacity. And when the prefrontal cortex is weakened, the older, more impulsive reward-seeking systems take over more easily. The pull toward distraction gets stronger. The resistance to it gets weaker. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern that unfolds in a predictable sequence in millions of people's lives every single day. And it's not happening because people lack ambition or discipline. It's happening because the system is genuinely stacked in a very specific direction. Here's the layer that most people miss entirely. The issue isn't just the presence of distractions. It's the fact that distraction has become your brain's primary coping mechanism for discomfort. Think about the moments when you reach for your phone most reflexively. It's rarely during moments of joy or calm. It's during moments of boredom, frustration, mild anxiety, mental friction, or the quiet dread that comes before a difficult task. Your brain has learned that distraction provides immediate, reliable relief from these uncomfortable internal states. And because it works, because it genuinely does reduce the feeling of discomfort in the short term, the behavior gets reinforced. Neurologically, behaviors that reduce negative states get encoded just as powerfully as behaviors that increase positive states. This means distraction isn't just a reward-seeking behavior, it's also an avoidance behavior. And that dual function makes it remarkably difficult to interrupt because it's serving two psychological purposes simultaneously. It's pulling you toward pleasure while pushing you away from pain. The brain doesn't distinguish between the two on a moral level. It simply registers. This behavior worked. Do it again. Over time, this pattern reshapes your baseline. This is the part that carries the most weight and gets the least attention. When your brain is repeatedly exposed to high-stimulation, low-effort dopamine sources, short videos, constant notifications, rapid content switching, it recalibrates. What neuroscientists describe as your hedonic baseline, the level of stimulation your brain treats as normal, begins to shift upward. Things that were once interesting start to feel flat. A single task activity that requires slow, sustained thinking begins to feel almost physically uncomfortable. Not because the task is harder than it used to be, but because your brain's threshold for what counts as engaging has been pushed significantly higher by chronic overstimulation. This recalibration is one of the most underappreciated explanations for why people who genuinely want to read more, focus more, or think more deeply find it so difficult even when they create the time and conditions to do so. It's not laziness. The brain has genuinely changed its expectations. Sitting quietly with a book feels like deprivation because the brain is now accustomed to a much higher rate of informational input. The discomfort is real. The craving is real. Understanding this doesn't excuse the behavior, but it reframes it completely. You're not weak. You're overstimulated and neurologically recalibrated. Now, there is an identity layer to this as well, and it's worth examining carefully. Most people, when they notice their distraction patterns, respond with one of two reactions. Either they judge themselves harshly, calling themselves lazy, unfocused, undisciplined, or they dismiss the behavior entirely as just how they are. Both responses are forms of identity reinforcement that make change harder. When you define yourself as someone who can't focus, your brain filters experience through that definition. It notices every failure and files it as evidence. It dismisses every success as an exception. Identity-based thinking is one of the strongest forms of cognitive bias, because your brain actively works to confirm whatever story it already believes about who you are. The more accurate framing is this: you are not someone who can't focus. You are someone whose attentional system has been shaped by a specific set of environmental inputs over a significant period of time. That distinction is not just philosophical. It's functionally important because environmental inputs can be changed. Behavioral patterns can be interrupted and rerouted. Neurological baselines can shift back, given the right conditions and enough time. The brain is plastic in the most literal sense of the word. What has been shaped in one direction through repetition can be reshaped in another direction through different repetition. This is where the practical becomes psychological rather than tactical. Most productivity advice operates on the assumption that the problem is organizational, that if you just schedule your time differently, use a better app, or build a morning routine, focus will follow. But the deeper issue is neurological. You're not trying to organize a calendar. You're trying to retrain a dopamine system that has learned very specific associations through thousands of repetitions. That takes a different approach entirely. The mechanism of change isn't restriction. Restriction alone creates deprivation, which the brain eventually rebels against. The mechanism is gradual recalibration, When you deliberately expose yourself to longer periods of low stimulation, focused activity not as punishment, but as practice, your brain begins to relearn that slow, deep engagement is itself a source of satisfaction. But this only works if you are consistent enough and patient enough to let the neurological adjustment happen. The early stages feel unrewarding. That's expected. The discomfort at the beginning is the system recalibrating, not evidence that it isn't working. There's also the matter of how you structure your environment, not as a trick to outsource willpower, but as a recognition of a neurological reality. Willpower is not a personality trait. It is a cognitive resource. It depletes. And placing high-stimulation distractions within constant reach while expecting your depleted prefrontal cortex to resist them indefinitely is a fundamentally flawed strategy. Reducing friction for focus and increasing friction for distraction isn't weakness. It's an accurate understanding of how the attentional system actually functions. The person who puts their phone in another room isn't cheating. They're applying neuroscience. The brain also responds powerfully to consistency in environment. When you perform focused work in the same physical context repeatedly, the brain begins to associate that context with the attentional state required. This is a Pavlovian process operating at the level of cognitive priming. Over time, sitting at that desk, in that chair, in that specific setup, begins to trigger focus-ready brain states before you even start. The environment becomes a cue. This is exactly the same mechanism that makes checking your phone in bed a habit. The bed became a cue for the phone, and now the two are neurologically linked. The same link can be intentionally built in the other direction, around deep work instead of distraction. What this all points toward is something quieter than most productivity conversations allow. The problem of distraction is not a time management problem. It's not a motivation problem. It's a systems-level issue rooted in how your brain processes reward, manages discomfort, responds to environmental cues, and encodes behavioral patterns through repetition. Every single layer of the mechanism is understandable. None of it is a verdict on your character. The people who gradually reclaim their attention don't do it by becoming more disciplined in the traditional sense. They do it by understanding what their brain is actually doing and working with that understanding rather than against it. They stop shaming themselves for the pull they feel toward distraction and start treating it as biological information. They build conditions that support their neurological reality instead of demanding that their willpower carry the entire load indefinitely. Attention, in the end, is not just a productivity asset. It is the medium through which you experience your own life. What you give your attention to consistently, over months and years, becomes what you experience as your existence. And the question worth sitting with is not how to hack your focus for better output. It's whether the things receiving your attention are the things you would actually choose if you were choosing from a calm and informed place rather than a reflexively stimulated one. That shift in awareness from automatic to intentional is not a dramatic transformation. It doesn't happen in a day or from a single moment of insight. But it starts with understanding the mechanism. And now, you do.